Apologies if I didn't catch up with you. Oh, sorry, I'm just listening to the recording and processing. For anyone who was there and I didn't get to catch up with at the time, my apologies. It was a mental evening of trying to run around and keep everybody happy and sort out IT and all those usual things. But anyway, it was a really great evening. We had great take up from Somerset, but actually wider afield. And as I probably briefed last time, it was really all about trying to start to talk about how do you, as a homeowner or as a potential home builder, go about doing this in a sustainable way. So we had speakers on green finance, speakers on passive house. We had, what else did we do? All sorts of bits and pieces, but basically what I said to Sonia was I'd give you just a sort of flavour of a couple of the bits and pieces that are coming through. So from the perspective of, I guess, being mostly homeowners or representing homeowners on this call, there was a lot of talk about the fact that if you want to retrofit your house, clearly it costs money. Now, I think the important thing to note from what was said is that it does, but it's all for a purpose, which A is to make sure that there is a planet to live on, but B, actually in the longer term, generally it'll create some sort of efficiency. But no one is denying the fact that actually most of us aren't sitting on bags of capital to be able to put solar panels in, insulate under our floors, put in, external insulation on all the properties, all that kind of good stuff. So there was a lot of chat around green finance and where they're going. And HSBC talked about how they're supporting businesses, but they talked very much around the market that's emerging around green mortgages and what's being offered there in terms of favourable rates, better rates if what you're doing is around retrofit or making your home more energy efficient. So I'd urge you to have a look at that and see what's available. HSBC themselves are being very open about the fact they're not there yet, but there are definitely other providers who are trying to sort that problem out and understand that they've kind of got a responsibility to help homeowners and businesses and everyone else to navigate this journey. It's kind of part of the finance industry's modern role is to do that. So that was the finance piece. We talked a lot about the skills shortage around the number of people required to make retrofit happen. And I'd love to turn around to you and say, guys, actually we came away with a really solid plan of action and it's all there, but there's a long way to go on that. So however, what I can report on is that since we last spoke, I've been up to Western College courtesy of several people on this call to talk about that skills challenge and had a really kind of productive and interesting conversation around that. And we also held our first retrofit morning at our Evercreech branch, obviously pretty much right in the middle of where you guys all are, to encourage the trades to get involved and understand and know what's going on, being with regard and being supported by the Green Register, who I know are on here somewhere, and future-proof. So that was a really, I don't think the weather help was a good start, and I know we've got plans to do more, but there is definitely a challenge around that skills gap, but also the availability. I mean, I'm sure any of you that have tried to get hold of a builder or an electrician or a plumber recently will know that they are pretty rare and hard to get hold of because they're all already very busy. So how do you persuade them to do something new that perhaps they're not competent about or skilled for when they've got plenty of traditional work to do that they can crack on with and make lots of money out of? So that was the bit around retrofit. And then probably the most exciting part of the evening, which I put in there on purpose, was that we brought in an architect from Taunton who specialises in passive house. And not only did he really sell why we need to go down the fabric first piece, and I'd urge you when talking about retrofitting older properties this evening to really make sure that it's so easy to get sidetracked by the modern heating technology. And the point is that there's absolutely no point in doing that until you've made your house insulated, airtight, you've got the ventilation right and all the rest. I'm probably preaching to the converted, but I will share the link to his video, Thomas from SE3, and I challenge any of you to come away from it not feeling slightly motivated to crack on and do it, but also to look at how you do it. And he shows some really interesting examples of how they take not old conservation area properties, but certainly older properties that were thrown up in a hurry after the war and convert them to passive house. And then the benefits he talks about. And again, I talk about I talked about the capital investment, but he talks about the long-term benefit to the residents and the landlords of those houses in terms of going about it and being able to do it at scale, which was really exciting. So that was the event. I have put, Sonia, in your, because for some reason I haven't got access to send everyone a message. So I've put in your chat box the link to the event. web page. On there today, we've hosted every single video of the presentations that occurred. So by all means, dive in there, have a look, and pick up the ones that pique your interest. But certainly the HSBC one's pretty enlightening. And there's also some really interesting information from Andrew Baddesley-Chapel, who leads the National Association for Custom and Self-Build, who talks about what's available for those that want to build, but build sustainably. So that was the event. And the other thing that I was talking to Sonia the other day, actually, we just got talking about ESG. So I just very briefly, can I have a show of kind of reactions, emojis, whatever you want to use, on who's going, yes, I totally get what Giles is talking about, or who's going, what on earth is ESG? So thumbs up if you know what you're talking about, or or hands up. Your hands up is good. Yeah, and then I don't know whether there's like an unhappy emoji for those that are kind of going, what is Giles talking about? I love it. The kind of muted, I'm sort of there, is really hilarious to watch. Sorry. So I just wanted to talk about it briefly, only because it's a journey that Bradford's are just undertaking now. And I think it's something that will be relevant to us all more and more as we look at how businesses operate and which businesses we choose to interact with. And at the moment, I think probably ESG sits very much in the corporate world and bigger businesses, but it'll come downhill to the SMEs and perhaps the developers and the builders that we work with to try and make this retrofit and insulation thing happen. So ESG, for those that you don't know, those that you do, I'm sorry, I'm going to do it anyway. ESG, for those you don't know, is environment, social and governance. And what it is a I'm going to say globally recognized, it kind of is. It's a globally recognized framework within which to hang sustainability. And I guess the crucial bit here is that when we're talking about insulating houses, when we're talking about retrofitting houses, when we're talking about low, pretty much, when we're talking about low, using low carbon energy, all that kind of stuff, we're very much sitting in, we think, the environment bit of sustainability. But of course, sustainability is a much bigger thing, and actually sustainability defined is simply enduring success. So you've got to, as a business, clearly you've got to make the numbers work, because if the numbers don't work, it doesn't matter what efforts you put into being environmentally more sustainable or socially more sustainable, but you've got to make that bit work. But in today's world, actually, that's not enough. And so people talk about profit and people and planet. So I just wanted to introduce that as a concept, something to look at. And explain and kind of very briefly explain. So at Bradford's, we've gone quite hard on the environment bit, mostly because of the downstream effect that we have. And I'm talking to a group of people right now, all of whom are looking at an environmental sustainability aspect to their lives, to their communities, to their properties. But in actual fact, it's rather bigger than that. And getting the social bit right and the governance bit right are crucial. And of course, actually the E, the S and the G aren't all separate. You don't do environment and assume that it'll act totally in isolation to social or totally in isolation to governance. So I just wanted to introduce that concept because I know Sonia said she thought it'd be useful for everybody. So I hope that kind of explains it. And I'll look forward to sharing. I can't yet because we haven't completed the exercise, but we're currently undergoing the exercise that says, what is our ESG? And it's funny, it's kind of said, what is our, I mean, ESG isn't a thing, it's just a way of looking at your strategy through a sustainability lens. But what is our ESG? And once that's established, actually, I'll look forward to sharing that with you and showing you what it means and what we do as a result from both an environmental and a social point of view. Is that enough, Sonia? Does that explain what you wanted?
Yes, I think that's really great. That was a lovely update on your last event and what's coming in the future. Yeah, I've been looking at ESG since we spoke about it, and all things buzzing around in my brain now. But we will now swiftly move on to Simon Corby from the Alliance for Sustainable Building Products. And well, I'll let him explain what ASBP does and how it works. If Simon's here. I haven't even checked if Simon's in the room.
He's not actually here.
Oh.
He asked me to talk a little bit about the ASBP at the end of my talk, so I'll add on a little bit about the ASBP. But yeah, he did he not?
No, I didn't get any message from him.
Ah, yeah, he had a bit of a personal issue that he had to go and sort out. So
fair enough.
Which he told me at about 6 o'clock after I'd written all my presentation. So I haven't added anything on to the end of mine. So I'll talk. I'll cobble something together.
Great. We'll go, if you can explain what ASBP is and
I'll do it at the
how
end of
it's
my
not.
talk.
If you'd rather do it that way round.
Well, it might make slightly more sense at the end of
Okay.
my talk. So yeah, I haven't got any sort of any slides or anything to show.
That's
so
fine. That's absolutely fine.
I'll bolt a little bit on at the end of mine.
Do you want to?
Do you want me to talk now? Oh, sorry.
Why
I thought
not?
Julia was going to go now. Okay, I'll do mine then. I'll take over from Simon. Can I share screen? Do I need to take over as a? I
believe you can. Hang on a second. Share screen. Let's make sure.
allow
Multiple
it,
participants. There it is. Yeah.
And oh, that's useful. Best to start at the beginning rather than the end. Find that occasionally. That one. Can you see my desktop now?
Yes.
Okay. Right. So I'm sort of talking about retrofitting homes with natural materials, but I'm going to add on a bit at the end about historic buildings as well. So firstly, with regard to retrofitting, again, I'm kind of talking to the converted, but nonetheless, when we talk about natural fiber insulation, it generally means plant or animal fibers. So we're looking at fibers that are actually grown rather than fibers that are manufactured from a plant or processed, heavily processed. So most of these fibers are quite easily removed from the plant, mechanically processed. The main kind of products you're going to come across, for those that don't know, would be hemp and sheep's wool. So that's quite a sort of a woolly kind of a product. Obviously the sheep's wool would be, but the hemp wool is made into a woolen type of product, which is, much like fiberglass or mineral wool, goes in between timbers quite easily. The biggest product on the market is actually wood fiber, and that's our main specialism, which is made from fiberizing waste softwood. So it's dried wood, it's ground up into a kind of a fluffy fiber and then formed into either a flexible woolen type material like sheep's wool, or a rigid board, which is then fixed to timber frames or masonry or roofs or whatever. And that normally is made from waste material as well. If it wasn't used for this, it would be pelleted and burnt, or it would just be burnt. So the other one would be cork. Cork's quite a popular one, made from the bark of the cork oak. And then the last one that you'll see fairly commonly is cellulose, which is made from recycled paper. So again, speaking to the converted slightly, why would you bother retrofitting insulation to your building? It is relatively expensive. It produces quite a lot of disturbance, so you really do need to be motivated to do it. But basically in solid wall buildings, so whether they're brick or stone or whatever, they're just generally cold. So at 11.5 months of the year, they are largely uncomfortable to be in. There are periods in the summer when they're actually really rather nice to be in, because it can be quite hot outside. But beyond that, most of the year it tends to be that they're rather uncomfortable. Now, everything that we do inside homes produces moisture. So breathing, washing, cooking, showering, everything produces a lot of moisture. And when you've got cold masonry surfaces around you, you get condensation, and that condensation on a continuous level begins to form mold. The mold produces spores which go into the air, and that gets into your lungs and can have fairly serious impact on your health. So to alleviate that, you can apply a layer of insulation either on the outside or the inside, but I am primarily going to talk about internal insulation. And by doing that, you're raising the surface temperature of your walls, or whichever surface it is you're insulating. That prevents mold growing because the temperature is higher and the surface is drier. And then obviously by insulating, you're saving energy as well. So there's a lot to do with comfort, health, and energy saving. Although the energy saving possibly is the most difficult sell, because the payback period on a lot of this stuff tends to be fairly long. So with all that said, why would you specifically use natural materials? Well, in plants, a lot of these materials are, a lot of these fibers are transporting moisture. They're absorbing and releasing water and other nutrients. So they tend to be incredibly complex structures, and it gives them incredible properties that are really, really useful in insulation, particularly when you're insulating up against masonry. I'm just going to very quickly whip through the different roles that insulation fulfills, and just explain why quickly these sort of products do particularly well. So starting with acoustic insulation, it's one of the largely forgotten ones, certainly in a lot of new build properties. Because these fibers are very dense, they tend to absorb sound extremely well, and typically would be about 4 to 8 times better at absorbing sound than the equivalent synthetic fibers. So they're extremely capable at doing that. Fire is obviously a pretty big topic. The nice thing about these fibers, they will very slowly burn in a fire, but what tends to happen is the surface chars and they burn very, very slowly. They also don't release cyanide or hydrogen chloride gas, both of which are pretty likely to kill you before you get out of the building. So although the building, these materials will slowly burn in a fire, they're not going to kill you before they let you out of the building, which is actually arguably better than the alternative. So health of occupants and installers. A lot of synthetic materials contain lots of different chemicals, binders and other materials that were used to actually produce the product. They off gas, they release a lot of volatile organic compounds when they're in situ, but also they expose the installers to a whole range of chemicals and particulates like glass fibers or mineral fibers. And there are impacts to getting these kind of products in your body. So, they're basically not particularly good for you. Comfort. Again, natural fibers, they tend to be very, very, very slow at changing temperature. So you can get very, very lightweight insulation and it'll insulate the building and give you this incredibly low U value on paper. But in practice, they tend to create buildings which change temperature very, very quickly and aren't particularly comfortable. Whereas, as I say, the natural fibers are very slow to change temperature, and that gives you a much greater level of comfort. This is not something you want your builder to be doing. So in terms of buildability, again, with natural fibers, they tend to be very, very simple. The detailing is extremely simple. You don't get shrinkage, you don't get off-gassing and changes in the structure and slumping and all these kind of issues that have dogged synthetic materials for some time. So, and again, you don't get this big difference in what's called the performance gap. So the difference between the design energy consumption and the in-use energy consumption. So that really is a big issue currently for a lot of modern buildings. Durability. So anyone who's ever built anything will know that it rains a lot in England, and anything you put up tends to get soaking wet, even though it may well have started off lovely and dry. So again, these fibers are fantastic at soaking up moisture, transporting it, letting it evaporate out quicker than pretty much anything else. And so whilst you may think on the surface, oh no, they're going to rot or fall apart or whatever, they're actually incredibly useful in construction because they do allow buildings to dry out. So many buildings do contain vapor barriers or barriers to moisture movement, which actually massively impedes their drying out. Sustainability. So as I said earlier, these are largely waste materials. The great thing about them is that they are absorbing carbon as they're growing. So by using these kind of products, you're actually locking up CO2 into your building. And reducing the carbon in the air right now, as opposed to things like Passive House is a great standard, but it is only a great standard if you're using low embodied energy materials, because if you build a Passive House out of concrete and steel and polystyrene now, the amount of energy that it's producing now takes a hell of a long time to offset against the running of the building. So it is really important that you use very, very low carbon or carbon negative materials like these. And then finally, thermal performance. Again, the overall heat loss is not just a measure of how low a conductivity the insulation is that you're using. So very, very low conductivity insulation doesn't guarantee you very, very low heat loss. The overall heat loss is affected by various other parameters, including the speed that heat actually moves through an insulation material. And again, natural fibers tend to take a long time to change temperature, and it takes a long time for heat to move through them, even though the conductivity, once they reach that equilibrium state, may not be as good as PIR, for example. So are there risks from retrofitting? Yes, there are, and it is largely around moisture. And the materials that you use have got to be able to accommodate moisture flow, and using impervious materials, generally, particularly up against historic buildings, causes the slow rise of moisture in the walls. And particularly when you've got timber, which nearly all historic buildings do have in the walls, joists, beams, lintels, wall plates, whatever. If you raise the moisture content of the wall, inevitably you begin to rot the timber that's bedded in the wall. So it is really important that you use vapor permeable materials, but also materials that are what's called hygroscopic and can transport moisture as well. So when we are creating specifications, we use some software called Woofy, which is a German derivation. And it basically shows you the heat and moisture flow through sections of walling. And using that sort of software, we can look at various different layers within the wall and fairly specific layers, and see what the moisture content is at any point, and just make sure that what we're designing is not going to cause problems 10, 15, 20 years down the line. So moving on to insulation, then, is internal or external insulation better? We get asked this all the time, but particularly with older buildings, it tends to be less easy to insulate them externally in terms of the visual appearance, or planning, or listed buildings consent, or all the other issues that you may come across, particularly on terraced buildings or the like. But basically, masonry absorbs a lot of infrared radiation. So even at 21 degrees, if you touch masonry, because it is so conductive and so heat absorbing, our skin is at 30, 35 degrees, and it will always feel cold. Internal insulation isolates you from that, and actually, thickness for thickness, you will get roughly twice the boost in comfort using internal insulation than you will using external insulation. And if we look at comfort, and not just U values and not just targets, but actual comfort, then that sort of outlook gives you much greater resource efficiency. So again, all of these natural materials, any material has a limited resource. It is a limited resource. We can keep growing it, but we can only grow it at a certain rate. So it's still important to use these materials efficiently. The other thing is that when the basic heat loss calculators are looking at the amount of heat loss you get through your walls, they tend not to include the heat loss that you get going down into the ground when you're using external insulation. So there is quite a significant amount of heat that goes down into the ground when you insulate externally. So internal insulation, you don't get that, because obviously you're insulating the wall before the heat gets to it. So there are generally a lot of benefits to using internal insulation. In terms of what that might look like, so this is a bit of a schematic. So the reddy browny bit would be the equivalent of a brick wall. There tends to be a leveling coat plaster that goes on the inside. In this case, we're talking about wood fibre insulation, so that would be pressed up against that, and then you'd have a lime plaster up on the surface of that. And the process that you go through is essentially you get heat and moisture. So whenever you've got heat movement, you also get moisture movement. So during the winter months, you've got this sort of flow of heat into the wall and moisture with it. And you do get condensation at the interface between the two. But materials like wood fibre and cork to some extent will lock up that moisture for normally during the winter months. Some of that will be in the wood fibre, some in the brick. And then as the weather warms up, you've got this huge increase in drying potential. So you get some moisture being drawn outwards, and some is drying back towards the interior of the room. And typically by sort of June, July time, all of that moisture that's accumulated during the winter months has dried out, and you're back to your sort of base state. And that's an annual process that goes on year after year after year. And again, when we're designing the property, the specifications, so long as the moisture level doesn't rise above a certain extent, you know, this can go on indefinitely, essentially. What that might look like would be kind of like this. So if you had a brick wall, we tend to use a clay base coat on the wall first, because clay actually buffers moisture much more effectively than lime, and gives you much better longevity and reduces the risk on the wood fibre boards. You'd have a lime plaster over it, and then you'd kind of decorate as per normal, really. This is a building in Somerset, up near Wellington, and the stonework's quite nice stonework, sort of sedimentary rock, and the inside looked much the same as the outside does. The wood fibre boards were fixed to the wall. We have these big mushroom-headed screws that that screw it back to the wall after the levelling coat has gone on. And the one thing you've got to do, it's fairly obvious, you know, when you're insulating the inside of your external walls where you need to insulate. The one bit that a lot of people do forget is that zone around your first floor, and it is absolutely critical that you bring your insulation up the wall, you cut your ceiling back and your floorboards back, and you carry that insulation on up through the floor zone, so that you don't get condensation around your joist ends, and again, you don't run the risk of rotting out your floor. So there's one other very strange property that you get with wood fibre, which is another reason that we tend not to really try and push people to go way below 0.3, a U value of 0.3, is you get an increase in performance between the theoretical U value relative to the as measured in situ U value. So if your theoretical U value was 0.35 and you actually measure it in situ, you'll probably come in at sort of the high 0.2s. And that's something to do with the way that water is switching between vapor and liquid in the structures in these fibers. And weirdly, it does give you a kind of an improvement in U value. I've never really found anyone that can satisfactorily describe it, but that's roughly what's going on. Finally, just want to say that, and this is kind of where we get onto the ASBP. So we'll talk a little bit about them now. So the ASBP is an organisation that brings in a lot of small distributors and manufacturers, much like ourselves, brings them all together and kind of magnifies the kind of impetus behind all these companies to be able to affect government legislation and actually, you know, affect the market as a whole. So, you know, they carry out work. So there's a certain amount of contact with the government and not exactly education, but showing them what is possible with natural fibre materials rather than always using standard synthetic materials. And they bring in all of these different companies. There is a vetting process, so it's not just a case of, you know, come in and pay the subscription fee and off you go. There are certain, you know, there is a barrier to entry, but they're a really useful organisation. They bring in a lot of information, a lot of technical information, so they kind of create a one-stop hub for architects and homeowners and lots of different people to be able to get reasonably impartial information as well. It's not just all sales nonsense. It's there's an awful lot of research, of proper peer-reviewed research, which actually guides the direction of the organisation. So yeah, it's quite a useful organisation to be part of. So with this particular project, and this is one of the kind of things that they do is they get involved in EU funded projects, which obviously is going to finish now, not being part of the EU, and actually bring in funding to do specific research. So this particular project was looking at how we can recycle polyester polyester bedding. So there's hundreds of thousands of tons of polyester bedding that just goes straight into landfill or into waste to power, you know, incinerators. And it's a perfectly usable material. You can refiberize it, so recycle it, clean it, chop it up, refiberize it. And then in this particular project with Thermofleece or Eden Renewables, they've added sheep's wool and hemp wool and other natural fibers to the polyester and looked at the different properties. and actually the sheep's wool one is probably the one that we'll stick with. But both materials have really useful properties. The polyester gives you a certain resilience and allows you to compress it heavily and really wrap it up tight, and then it will kind of spring back to shape when you take it out of the packet. But then the sheep's wool brings in the ability to buffer moisture and gives you actually quite good sort of mold resistance, all these kind of things that benefit natural fibre insulation. So that's a project that we've been involved with for the last 2 years, coming to an end now. But again, ASBP have done actually continue to do quite a lot of these projects with reducing packaging. I've done other sort of waste recycling projects. So a really good source of information for anyone looking to retrofit, but also all the way up to commercial level about how you can commercialize all sorts of different materials. I think that's it. Sorry, I probably went on a bit long there.
Thanks, Chris. I should have actually introduced you to start with, but thank you for putting your name and the company name at the end. There were actually there were a few questions that came in on the chat that I think it probably would make sense to answer those now, since you've just been speaking. I'm just trying to scroll down through the questions. Hang on, there's one about external insulation. Just a query about how does the external insulation, because you were talking about it conducting down into the ground, conducting the heat, and is that because the wall itself, you said the walls were conductors, the stone itself was a conductor? So
the masonry is very conductive, and obviously it's sat in the ground, so you can externally insulate it, but you can't obviously get underneath it and kind of up the inside and everything else. So you do lose a reasonable bit of heat down into the ground. I see, Cara, you were wondering about the thermal mass properties of masonry walls. Very good. Masonry has a level of thermal mass that is way beyond what we can reasonably use in this country. It gives you it prevents what are called fabric gains. So in other words, the heat that comes through the fabric itself. And so there's enough thermal mass to do that. But by insulating internally, yes, you are isolating yourself from that, but you would have to heat the masonry to up to sort of 30 degrees to really get the benefit of the momentum of that within an insulated envelope. As I say, masonry at 20 degrees, whether it's got insulation on the outside of it or not, is still relatively uncomfortably cold. And you touch a wall, even if it is externally insulated, it still feels cold. So internal insulation with materials like wood fibre, which do have quite a lot of thermal mass themselves, is generally a better way forward.
Next question was, how thick is internal insulation?
That's a good question.
So how much space do you lose on the inside of your house?
Yeah, it depends what you can reasonably afford to lose. So 40 mil would be the absolute minimum. And actually the difference between an uninsulated limestone wall or even a 9-inch brick wall or something, and a wall with 40 mil insulation on there, you're reducing the heat loss by about 65%. But you're also improving your levels of comfort hugely. So not only are you reducing your heat loss, but you're getting to a point where you don't need to heat the building so much to get the same level of comfort. So if you're used to walking around in a jumper, you can do that at 18 degrees instead of 21 degrees. So 40 would be the absolute minimum. We normally try and encourage people to go for 60 as a minimum, because that does about 75% of the heat loss. But the point is really that last bit of heat loss, you're having to go up to serious thicknesses to chip away at that last bit. And from a cost perspective, you can obviously do passive house retrofit, and if you've got the funds to do that, that's great to be able to do that. But it is a barrier to entry. So insulating even at 40 mil is a vast improvement over not insulating at all. So we are much of the opinion that if you can't afford to do passive house, then there's absolutely nothing wrong with going for 40 mil of insulation on your walls, and and then potentially adding more at a later date. But that's a pretty good start.
So the insulation is more expensive as it gets thicker.
It is, and the insulation obviously increases in cost. You've got additional fixings which get more expensive as they get thicker. The labour cost increases slightly, but it is more of a material cost that is changing. And as I say, the amount of energy that you're saving, these sort of incremental little bits that you're chipping away at, you know, you can double the cost of the materials, and you're only sort of saving an extra 5 to 10% in your heat loss, which, you know, it doesn't sort of stack up financially for a very, very long time.
Okay, so the next question was, how do you stop water getting into internal insulation if you're putting up shelves and pictures onto you're screwing things into the wall?
Thank you, Cara. So it depends on the thickness. So the thicker the insulation goes, the more important it is to maintain the plaster layer, and also we specify a different type of plaster as the insulation gets thicker. So with quite thick insulation, we've got a plaster that acts as a vapor control layer. When you're down to about 40 or 60 mil of insulation, it's really just a decorative finish. You don't need to worry, and for airtightness, you don't need to worry so much about moisture transfer. Generally, you would obviously try not to make holes in the plaster layer, and you would seal up around any screws with, you know, some sort of caulk or mastic or whatever. But yeah, so it just depends on the thickness, and but again, we've got lots of different thickness things that you can use with it to do different things.
Do you have any advice to stop moths from appearing around a decade after installing sheep's wool, once the moth repellent has stopped working?
No. No, that's not my forte. I'll have to ask Mark. I know Mark Lynn from Eden Renewables quite well. So I think they have got over that. I don't know what it is they've changed, but as far as I'm aware, they have, you know, the latest incarnation of Thermofleece and all the other products they sell don't have that issue. But yeah, I'm aware that some products did back, you know, 10 years ago and more. Okay, so
we'll get that information, and I'll send that round when I send that out. Are there any other questions? Just scrolling through.
How do you manage the required ventilation improvements? You've been busy, haven't you, Cara? So ventilation is really important. Trickle vents are not ventilation. Trickle vents allow ventilation and uncontrolled ventilation when it's windy. But ventilation systems are incredibly useful for improving indoor air quality. Yes, they are a mechanical solution, but if you've and I understand that you know, there are a lot of people that are fairly hesitant to install these systems if they've never lived in one. I've got one in my house, I've got one in this room, and I would never be without one again. The air quality is amazing. You know, it keeps the humidity levels down. You don't ever get stuffy. You know, if you want to open the window, you open the window. It doesn't restrict you in any ways, but it does continuously supply you with fresh, warm, dry air, which does make a huge difference to the indoor air quality. How do you do it? It's just a case of if you're doing internal insulation, you do need to work on air tightness. And then there are various different decentralized systems where you can have individual units for each room, or you can have a centralized system which supplies you know, all the air from one point. But yeah, I mean, that's a kind of a practical question. It does depend on you know, what your house is like and whether you've got the space to use it.
Got another question about how do householders find tradesmen who will do this work reliably, which we sort of covered in our last webinar about, you know, doing things like going through Trustmark, and I wondered if ASBP also kind of provides. Not so
much ASBP, but certainly AECB do. So there's a lot of AECB members who are, so it's aecb.net. If you go onto their members directory, there's a whole list of people there that do this kind of work. The other thing, I mean, obviously you've got to go by recommendation, but we also have a huge amount of information online. And the other reason that we specify the systems we specify is their simplicity. So we're looking at kind of, you know, competent DIYers being able to do most of what we would put forward. The only thing that you might want a specialist for is doing the finish plastering, but you know, the actual installation of most of our systems is DIYable. So, but again, we've got courses and guidance and everything online to allow people to do that. But yeah, it is a problem generally in the UK, I think.
Okay, so whenever, if you could share with us any of the the links to the courses that you run for that. I think
Yeah,
that would be very interesting for all of our members.
Yeah, it's all free to use. It's free for anyone to use, whether using our materials or not. It's just there for everyone to use. So there's a link on our homepage, which goes to it's called Fibres training site, and yeah, it's lots of different courses for internal, external, roof insulation, timber frame insulation, all sorts.
Okay, great. Thank you, Chris.
It's okay.
I think we're there. Oh no, there was one question: is there an alternative for plasterboard for the internal finish material?
As Giles said actually about breather plaster, the guys that make breather plaster are bringing out a hemp-based plasterboard, but to be fair, they have been bringing it out for quite a while. So I'm hoping that they actually have got to the end of their sort of design and manufacturing process. So that would be an alternative, but there are wood wool boards. So in terms of skimming, you need a fairly flat finished board to be able to skim on it. So you can use their breather plaster that Giles talks about, and various other lime plasters. There are things like, well, wood fibre you can plaster directly onto with lime, wood wool boards, but they tend to need a thicker layer of plaster, so you wouldn't generally skim straight onto them with a really thin lime skim. So that breather plaster board will be, you know, a good one when it comes out, but other than that, it's like I say, wood wool or wood fibre.
Great, thank you very much, Chris. I'm going
No
to
problem.
now hand over to Julia from the Green Register.
Hello everyone, thank you for inviting me to come to your lovely inquiring group. I'm going to repeat some of the messages you've heard in slightly different formats, but that's never a bad thing with retrofit. So I'm just going to share screen. Now, can you all see that? Can you see it as a...
Yes.
Yeah.
Is the slide filling the whole page?
Yes, I can see retrofitting older houses. Julia Bennett, the Green Register.
Excellent. So a little bit about me first. I work as a training development person at the Green Register, which was founded over 20 years ago to help people like yourselves and architects and professionals and builders and installers to understand more about sustainable construction. And of course, retrofit has become probably the single most important element because it's so under-resourced in the UK at the moment. Well, actually, it's getting better resourced in Scotland and Wales at the moment, but and Northern Ireland. So in England, we're suffering a bit. I'm a low carbon architect. I sit on the board of the AECB that Chris just mentioned, and we network with many of the same people. So it's lovely to. I've got a slide with ASBP on it as well, so we'll take it from there. So we're talking about trying to deliver responsible retrofit. We all want to do this properly. As you probably heard in various messages, we have to look at the whole house rather than just a single element, because all of the elements where they meet together are very significant as to the benefits or the risks that are going to come out from the things that you do to your house. And even if you've got a street of houses that were all the same when they were built, by now, they're not the same. So each property is unique, which is both fantastic, but it's also a problem because there isn't a one-size-fits-all approach. So some of the principles that Chris has been sharing, they sound very technical, but it's because we're having to think about each property and its very unique characteristics. So we start with the condition of the property, we look at the structure, the damp, if there's any mold, and instantly we're being alerted to any problems that already pre-exist. We would also look at your current fuel bills, how comfortable is everything. Chris mentioned things about the internal air quality and the thing that carpets and internal finishes, paints and things like that can emit chemicals in the lifetime of you using the building that are not very good for your health. Clearly, in this group, climate is a major issue. We want to be able to reduce our carbon footprints, but we've also got the issues of the fact that we're talking about older properties. If I'd known that we were missing the architect, I probably could have spoken to that, but I'll just carry on with what we've got, and if people have specific questions. And then you all have aspirations about your properties, and you all have constrained budgets. So one of the other elements of a whole house approach is actually working out what are the top priorities for you. It's not easy making the decisions. So we talk about a whole house plan. So even if you're only got a small budget, you still look at the whole house and try and assess what would be the most appropriate things to do that would improve the comfort, reduce your bills, and not cause damage to the property. As an architect, when I'm doing retrofit projects, I trained in Passive House and Enefit. So I actually use the energy modeling. I do a model of the baseline house, and then I model options of what the different retrofit measures would do to your bills and your energy demand and your ventilation rates and things like that. So there are ways that you can technically work out what the benefits are of different retrofit options. But the singular thing that Wolfgang Feist always used to say when he was talking about the Passive House retrofit model is, any element that you touch, do it to the absolute best quality that you can. Because for things like window replacements, you'll probably never do that again if you're upgrading elements. So do the best you can rather than trying to spread everything very thinly, because you can do retrofit in phases. It just has to be carefully thought about. And it's easy for me to write, use experienced retrofit practitioners, which we all know is the holy grail at the moment. And Green Register is very involved in trying to train more and more practitioners. And I can talk about some of the ways that we do that later. I'm sure you're familiar, houses lose heat just about from every pore. And if you've seen any thermographic imaging, then you will have seen that around windows and doors and thresholds and junctions in the roof and everything else, all that lovely expensive air that you've heated is just, it's just going out through air leakage. And again, Chris mentioned air tightness and air leakage and the fact that trickle vents are just holes in your house that you can't control. So they're not a positive thing in terms of carbon management. So I think Cara also put in the chat about STBA is the Sustainable Traditional Buildings Association, and a number of years ago they created a guidance wheel, which is something that you can go online and it's very interactive. And what it helps you do is, when we're talking about risk management, you can look at, for example, what you might do to an open fireplace with a chimney, which obviously if you're not using it all the time, is just, again, it's another massive hole to the sky for your nice warm air to disappear up the chimney. And how you assess what the associated linkages to different other elements of the building. I'm not describing it very well, but it is interactive and it is on this link, which Cara's also put in the chat. And it's quite an it's got lots of technical information behind it. So if you feel like you really want to understand what happens if you block up your chimney to your ventilation requirements and things like that, or when you're putting in new windows, what impact does that have where you're looking at the reveals of the windows with internal wall insulation and things like that. So it's a useful source of help in understanding the different options and their impacts. Here's Alliance for Sustainable Building Products that we've mentioned. On their website, they have a little interactive house that you can click on various things, and the people that are members of that make sustainable products will come up listed. So it's a quick a quick way, obviously back to earth, eco-merchant, ecological building systems, all kinds of super people are selling products, but this is quite a good way of just getting straight to some of those. So here we have a really interesting diagram of a solid walled house and the various elements that are involved. Excuse me, this is actually a rubble stone wall. So we've got a nice open outside wall. It's pointed in lime, not cement. So cement mortar is actually very tricky. I'm sure if you own older buildings, you'll know. The stone tends to crack before the cement does, which is exactly what it shouldn't do. So if you're ever repointing an old building, use lime mortar if you can. It also enables that moisture progression that Chris was talking about. And then on the inside, we also want something that allows that moisture. So that annual cycle of drying out, doesn't matter if a wall's wet up to a point, because the annual cycle will dry it out internally, externally, as long as you've not got impervious materials. And this is why the natural material side of it that Chris was talking about is so important, because the majority of the natural materials enable that movement of moisture. And moisture, as Chris said, is critical in retrofit. You can do more damage by blocking in moisture on both sides of walls and roofs and floors to your property than that, you know, by using just by accident, which is why you're having sessions like this. So there we go. Technical detailing is also very important. And it's, as I said, it's at the junctions between elements. So where roofs meet walls, where floors meet walls, where intermediate floors meet walls, where windows meet walls. You can see why we talk about walls a lot. I think we understand perhaps that IWI is internal wall insulation, EWI is external wall insulation. Chris has taught. It's great. I'm just following on from you, Chris, really. So here are just a couple of images about how you might approach internal wall insulation. So one of the first things is, Chris did have a drawing of this, but this is just in actual images of it happening. So you have to smooth up your walls and make a butter coat or a parge coat in order to be able to put products like the wood fibre boards. Another way of doing it is that you get to this stage and then you put timber battens and you fit the boards in between the timber. So there's no right way. There are lots of wrong ways, but there's no single right way of doing it. So that was just to give you a bit of a visual understanding of the layers that go into it. And then on top of the boards in that bottom photograph, you would apply, ideally, lime plaster. Because of that moisture migration that we're talking about. Gypsum plaster doesn't really allow moisture to move in the same way. It's much cheaper, but it's not necessarily the right thing for older houses. One of the other critical elements, if you've got windows, for example, like these ones they look like original sash windows, they're probably single glazed, and you might not, if it's a listed building, be allowed to do anything with it. You've still got the internal insulation going into the reveal, and you must insulate the reveal because if you do ever come to replace the windows, you want the whole lot to be the best it can possibly be in terms of saving that heat. This is just a couple of images from I want to say Mike Y, but I think it might be T Mar, but there are specialist suppliers like Chris and everyone else. And this one just is a really useful comparison of the different thicknesses that you would need. So at the top of each image, I hope you can see that the solid wall is being calculated as having a U value. So that's a measure of how much heat is going through a meter square at 1.64. And you can drop that down because down is good with a U value. It's a measure of how much heat is passing through. So we want that to be the lowest number it can be. You know, we can get right down to 0.32. If you use materials like Chris mentioned from oil stock, like Kingspan and Celotex, they're called PIR, polyisocyanurate insulation. You can get much lower U values, but they're closed cell materials and they don't they don't have any give in them. So you end up with gaps between the boards. It's very difficult to get continuous insulation. Similarly, for roof construction, getting everything, you can see how beautifully that is drawn, that the insulation is absolutely perfect up against those historic timber rafters. But there are specific sequences, and ventilation of roof spaces and insulation is something that you would need to read up on or ask an expert. Timber suspended floors. I'm going to show you a slide in a minute of an intermediate floor, so a first floor, but it's quite tricky because you end up, there aren't any ways of insulating suspended ground floors without taking up the floorboards that I feel really confident in. And that's my personal experience. That's not what anybody else might say. So, you know, it's very difficult, but the right way to do it is to actually create little nests of airtight membrane for the insulation to sit in. You can't just sort of drop it in and hope for the best, because you end up with a lot of air leakage around the edge. And I'm actually working on a property now where the clients have done this, but not well. And we've just done air tightness testing and thermography, and it's just leaking like a sieve, and it's very sad because they're not going to lift the floors again. So that brings me back to the point of always do it to the best of your ability. Here's an example of someone who has done the kind of gold standard of how you handle, it's not for everyone, how you handle the way that joists are built into solid walls. So what they've done is they've cut back the joists, put in parge coat behind the joists, and then actually wedged a ledger plate with compact foam, which is the white polystyrene type material. Everyone has an opinion on this. Not many of you would go this far, but it is quite tricky. And Chris showed the more acceptable, probably more common detail of where you actually insulate very carefully and make sure that you've got that insulation tucked between the joists. I'm gonna stop there because I'm sure I've overrun in time, but we are a training organisation. We do have a series called Retrofitting Traditional Buildings, amongst many other subjects that we do. If you're interested in learning a bit more, this is a 3-part series that's coming up in September, but by all means go to the website and have a look at some of our other training as well. And I hope that's been useful to some degree. Happy to answer questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Julia. That's great. I didn't realise that you were an architect as well. I'm sure that people do have some questions, actually, particularly on the retrofitting of older buildings and in conservation areas. Keris, who was unable to join us tonight, felt that it is possible, but I think people had lots of questions about double glazing, for instance, and changing windows in an area, in a conservation area. And apparently it is possible to do, but there's, Keris was going to explain how to navigate the planning regulations in those instances. I don't know if you would be able to talk about that at all.
Okay, well, planning is a movable feast because it depends which officer you get and which conservation officer you've got. So although there are rules, they're different everywhere because it's personal interpretation. But generally speaking, if you're in a conservation officer, if you're in a conservation area, find out what the protected characteristics of your conservation area are. So if it's just your front elevation as part of a streetscape, then you'll be able to just assess if it's single glazed sash windows or beautiful stone detailing. It will lead you down a path of what is possible and what isn't. So you wouldn't think of external wall insulation in that situation. But in terms of the window replacements, generally speaking, conservationists want anything to be either replaced so that it looks exactly the same if you're doing window or door replacements, so you can improve the thermal performance, or that it's removable, such as secondary glazing, so that the original is unharmed. And it depends on the grade of what they call its heritage, what's its status as a heritage asset. So obviously a grade 1 listed building, they even get very pernickety if you want to change a pane of glass, that it has to be a certain kind of glass, because otherwise you get, if you put in double glazing, you get reflections that aren't there in the original character of that historic building. So it can go from one extreme to the other. And when you're doing an application for changes to a heritage asset, you have to do an assessment. And very often somebody like, I'm not familiar with her name, say it again for me.
Keris.
Keris, okay. It sounds like she would be a fantastic first point of call, because she would be able to help you assess what it is that the conservation team are going to look at and try to protect, so that you've already come over as sympathetic and supportive of their aim in your proposal. Does that help?
Yes, great, thank you. And just for the sake of the recording, because I mentioned this before, that I will be sharing Keris's phone number. She's very kindly offered her to answer people's questions for free, do free consultations for anybody living in a conservation area, and talk you through the process. I did also try to contact 2 of the conservation officers in Somerset, but sadly didn't get any response. So I hope that anyone who is in that situation and needs a conservation officer will have better luck than I in contacting them. But
they're just incredibly under-resourced at the moment. They're just flat out, and it's not how they want to be by any means.
I've no doubt. And there's a really great question from Cara, asking Julia if you would encourage terraces to come together to retrofit collectively for efficiency and ability to retrofit adjoining properties well.
Absolutely. If you've got a crowd of neighbours on a street that are able to work together, especially in the case of if you are able to do external wall insulation. Sometimes you can't do it on the front, but you might be able to do it all along the rear. It makes perfect sense, but it is tricky getting neighbours to work together. And we haven't even touched on party wall issues. So if you're in terraced or semi-detached properties, you have duties under the Party Wall Act about notifying neighbours on work. So obviously if you can work collectively, and it means that you're only getting one builder's quote instead of 12 or whatever, it makes sense, but it's quite hard work in my experience. That doesn't mean don't try it.
Okay, do we have any other questions? Yes, just to answer, so Rufus has put in a question about first port of call. Sounds like a whole house audit, and that is exactly what a retrofit assessment is. And I strongly urge everyone to contact the Somerset Retrofit Accelerator Programme to find out more. Thank you very much, Julia.
Pleasure.
I am now going to hand over to Sandra, who is with NEF and running a program called the Super Homes Programme. And they've been working with some other Climate Action Network groups to roll out retrofit assessment programs and so on. So if Sandra, if you're here.
Yeah, I'm here. Can you hear me okay?
Hi, Sandra.
Yes.
Yes.
Right. I'm also going to try and share my screen, so I'll just do that now. Okay. Can you see that? Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So I'm Sandra Hayes. I'm the Director of Development at the National Energy Foundation, and we're based in Milton Keynes, but we are sort of a national organisation, and we've been established for quite a while, since 1988. And over time we've done different things, but very much now our focus is on domestic retrofit. And super homes is one of the projects that we've been doing for a number of years. We also have a lot of projects that focus on fuel poverty and trying to alleviate fuel poverty, which is a massive issue at the moment. So we work with a number of housing associations, sort of mostly in the areas around where we're based. And we also sort of manage eco-flex projects on behalf of local authorities. So so that this is where local authorities have said a wider group can benefit from eco than just the people who are on sort of state benefits, so generally people who are on a low income. So just a bit of background about super homes. It was started as long ago as 2007 by a group of very committed individuals who were very keen on retrofitting their homes, and actually the name started off as old homes, super homes, because it was very much about sort of proving that you could do something with an older property to make it more energy efficient. And it was all about reducing your sort of carbon dioxide emissions by at least 60% from when you first moved in. And the homes are open to the public once or twice a year. It was very much focused on peer-to-peer learning. So again, as I said, because you could go and visit somebody's property, we'd also have information on our website about the properties and what the owner had done, and you could contact the owner to find out about their experience, any tips that they had, and which builders, etc., that they used. We actually we ran out of funding for the project because it was very resource intensive having the open days, but we decided to sort of invest in it ourselves, and we relaunched in April last year with a new rating scheme. So we've sort of, now there are two elements to super homes. One is the sort of a membership network, and one is the rating scheme itself. So the network is there to support sort of individuals and community groups, and we're working with housing associations, local authorities, and also with trades to sort of support them in their retrofit journey. And so we have different types of membership for individuals, for landlords, and for industry, and those are some of the logos of our members. So if you become a member, you can sort of come to our events, and we hold them monthly for individuals. We've had ones on things like is a heat pump right for my home? We also have regular events where you can ask some of our original super homers who are part of the original project, who we now call our pioneers. So you can ask the pioneer about their experience of retrofit. We also have sort of member-only forums and meetings and a monthly newsletter. I suppose what I would say about the rating scheme, I mean, it's great to hear everything that everyone has been saying about retrofit and what can and can't be achieved, is I suppose the rating scheme is a way of having recognition of what you've actually managed to achieve with your retrofit. So it measures outcomes. And when we had the original super homes, it was very much based on making a 60% carbon saving from when you moved into the property. So there were some homes that could be get that 60% much more easily than others, depending on where you started from. So if you moved into a newer property, obviously it was harder to reach that 60%. If the boiler had already been replaced for a fairly new condensing gas boiler, again, it was more difficult to get to that 60% because you didn't have those kind of easy, relatively cheap wins that you could make. And I think we also recognise that although 60% was great, we need to do more now because of imminent concerns about climate change, and also possibly fuel prices and reliance on fossil fuels to heat our homes. So we developed this sort of 5-star rating scheme, and you can become it doesn't matter which method you choose to sort of improve the performance of your home. So you might be going for an retrofit or a passive house level, but this is kind of neutral in terms of the method that you, or the technology that you use to get there. So we have these 5 stars. They now, rather than just looking at carbon dioxide emissions, we're also looking at sort of heat loss per metre square, and we're also looking at health and comfort, which is something that's already been mentioned a few times as well. So you can see there set out on this slide, the residual sort of carbon emissions and the heat demand. Obviously, something like retrofit or passive house, the residual heat demand per metre square per year is even lower than our sort of 5-star rating, but we don't have the same sort of focus on air tightness, perhaps, as retrofit does. If you have a gas heating system, doesn't matter what the fabric performance is, you can only reach a 1-star rating, because we sort of see that as sort of being something that's obviously being legislated and being phased out, and we're really sort of looking towards properties that have got probably it's either going to be some kind of electric or possibly a biomass heating system if they were perhaps in a rural area. So to become a super home, it's necessary to have monitoring done for a 12-month period. So we will be monitoring things like the heat of the rooms, carbon dioxide levels, humidity levels. We'll be looking at energy bills, but there'll be an occupant survey as a part of that as well. So my next slide just sets out in a bit more detail, and I appreciate it's probably quite difficult to read on here, but it kind of sets out more of the sort of parameters of what we're looking for in terms of thermal comfort and moisture levels, and how much sort of a variation will be acceptable over a period of a year. But obviously happy for the slides to be shared afterwards. So the customer journey that we recommend sort of follows the PAS 2030 and 35 route, and as has already been said, what is really key is getting that whole house retrofit plan or whole house audit. So that's not necessarily a part of it doesn't have to be part of the super homes customer journey. You could seek to become a super home at the point where you've already done your retrofit, but we, along with the other speakers, recognise that getting that advice from a professional retrofit coordinator or a retrofit professional at the beginning is really key to making sure that mistakes aren't made at the very beginning. So so the customer journey is really that you become a member of the Super Homes network, and the customer can either themselves find a retrofit coordinator from the Trustmark website, or we will try and help them find a retrofit coordinator, because what we also recommend, although again it's not compulsory, is that it's possible to get a design stage super home assessment done, and this is carried out by the retrofit coordinator, who we've given additional training to, and this will tell you what we anticipate your super homes rating would be if you did the measures that you've selected in your whole house retrofit plan. Once you've got your plan, you may need a retrofit designer to help you sort of with the process of selecting installers and products, but you would then get your retrofit done. And, you know, as has been said again, and from our experience of working with our pioneer super homers, we know that sometimes it takes many years for somebody to complete their retrofit. And even once they've done it, they might go back and do more later, particularly now we're sort of seeing, you know, interest in sort of heat pumps. And so some of our pioneers are now looking at heat pumps where they didn't have a heat pump originally. So yeah, so that the customer would then, you know, themselves decide when they felt that they were ready to have the sort of the monitoring and evaluation done, which, as I said, will take place over a period of a year. So there is a fee to pay for being evaluated as a super home, and that, as I said, then once the monitoring, etc., has been done, we will then say whether or not we think that they have reached that the property has reached the super home standard and what rating that they will receive. So that is sort of as set out in the diagram there. I just wanted to obviously we were invited along to this talk partly because of you being a climate action network. So we are actually working at the moment with two organisations in Hampshire, WINAC and PCAN, who are based in Winchester and Petersfield. We've got funding from Redress to sort of develop this service. So we're very much working alongside the community group. So they have both been able to appoint sort of project officers to help with the funding that we've had to sort of do this sort of hand holding and sort of some of the marketing to members and others in their local community. So you know, but we are also working with them, looking at you know, we're sort of supporting them with finding the retrofit coordinators. We're lucky to have subsidies to help cover the cost of retrofit whole house retrofit plans and super home assessments for those on sort of low or middle incomes. And we've got some grant funding for solar PV. We've just asked if because you know, the aim is to have show homes, if we can have use some funding for insulation, because we recognise that there is funding around, or there will be when Eco4 comes out, for people on sort of low incomes. But if you don't meet one of the criteria, you know, on health or income, there's basically at the moment virtually no funding to support insulation, which we know is the first thing that you do. We should be doing is always looking at insulation first. So it has been helped by us obviously having this funding, but we want to create a legacy service. So to sort of like work with other community groups as to how this kind of service can be rolled out. So it's really sort of a hand-holding service with a kind of being assessed against a rating scheme at the end of the process. So this is a case study from one of our pioneer super homers. So they made a really significant carbon saving through doing a lot of different measures. And I think this lady also was an architect, or she's certainly an energy consultant. So you know, it was a major effort put in. And I think she was saying one of her motivators was to sort of practice what she was preaching. And I've certainly done the same in terms of my own home. You know, I spent a lot of time encouraging others to retrofit their home. So I did my own home. I am in a conservation area. There's no way I could have done the front externally, but I did have the front done internally. And yeah, that whole windows debate is an interesting one. Got PV, you know, got double glazing at the back, but I'm not allowed to change my sash windows at the front. With our local council, it seems to be very much based on what you had to start with. If your windows had already been replaced with sort of aluminium or some sort of poor quality UPVC, you can change it to something that looks like a sash window, or is a sash window, but not necessarily wood. But if you've got the original sash windows, you're in a lot of difficulty. So I've gone down the route of putting in some secondary glazing which is pretty good, but I know it's not as good as, you know, if I could put in proper double glazing. So I think that's it. That's just our contact details and the direct number to Super Homes if you're interested to find out more. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sandra. I just wondered if the ratings that you were talking about, is that it's a different rating to the EPC ratings, is it?
Yes, it is. Yes,
it's your own.
It's our own rating. I mean, it's we do the you know, the kind of the ratings have been sort of based on SAP 10, using fuel costs in that, and obviously we know now the fuel costs have gone through the roof, so that the, you know, the potential financial savings will be even higher. But yeah, it's not the same as EPC.
Okay. And before we go, there's one question from Jennifer Morissetti, who joined Super Homes in March and asks how she should go about getting a rating. Are you able to let her know?
Yes. I don't know what stage she is at. If she just drops us an email, I mean, I think as probably everybody knows, there's a real shortage of retrofit coordinators at the moment. So in fact, I think actually I did see somebody, sorry, is it one of our retrofit coordinators, Andrew Stagler's here. I don't know if he wants to pipe up, but in some cases, but it's more people who are in the north and Scotland at the moment. We're really struggling to find retrofit coordinators. So sometimes there's a delay in people being able to get their whole house retrofit plan and super home assessment. But we are, you know, actively at the moment trying to recruit. In fact, we're trying to recruit somebody to work in-house for us, but that's proving to be pretty difficult. But yes, she just drops us a line. We'll see what we can do with using the email address that I just sent out, which is superhomes@nef.org.uk.
Great, thank you. superhomes@nef.org.uk. I'm just going to type that in again.
Yeah.
And I really need to remind everybody, you mentioned about show homes and peer-to-peer education. We've got our very own Somerset Retrofit Accelerator Programme. Has been, they've also been putting together some green open homes for us to view, and if you want to register to see that, please go to the link. I'm going to share it again just in case, to South Somerset Environment.co.uk/energy saving tips, and there is a webinar this Thursday evening at 7 p.m. Where you can see some of the homes here in Somerset which are have been and are currently being retrofitted. And actually there's I believe there's a whole YouTube channel being put together just of different homes at different stages, and where the homeowners are talking about their particular journey. Does anybody else have any questions they'd like to ask before we wrap up? Not seeing anyone with their hands up. Brilliant. Okay, I think we've done it all. Thank you very much, everyone, for your time. We are finishing 3 minutes early. Thanks everyone for turning up to do your presentations. Really, really useful information. It was a lot to cover in a really short space of time, but I will be sharing some more detailed information, and there'll be links when I send out the recording, so you can investigate a little bit further and deeper should you need to. So that's it. Thank you very much from all of us at Somerset, and see you again another time.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sonia, and thank you everyone who did presentations. Really helpful. Thank you very much.
Thank
Thank
you
you for coming. Nice to see you all.
Bye.